All right, Friday night. I'm sweating down here and you're freezing up there.
I'm wearing a long sleeve shirt, and honestly, it's unseasonably cold here.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, it's going to be highs in the 50s.
Oh, I hate you. Well, we're high of 50s in Celsius.
Exactly, exactly. So I'm still up in Coeur d'Alene, and I'm actually doing we were just talking about this off air. I'm doing a bike race tomorrow, and I've never done a gravel bike race. So it's a gravel bike race that goes up to Mount Spokane, and you gain 5,000 feet in about 29 miles, I think it is.
Fearless, fearless. I love
Yeah.
it.
And this is fearless. But it's gonna be really cold. And I didn't pack a lot of cold weather
Right,
stuff. Like I knew it
right.
was gonna be chilly, but
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna be layered up tomorrow on this ride. And when you get to the top of those things, I don't know if you've ever done a hill climb, but you get to the top and you get really cold really
Yeah,
fast.
that's right.
Now, fortunately, they've got like where they bring a bag from the start up for you.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's I'm kind of excited to try something new.
Yeah,
It's not a sanctioned race, but
right.
it's fun. There's actually cash prizes.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll win a little money. We'll see.
There you go.
I doubt it. I'm pretty sore from a week's worth of
Yeah,
training.
yeah.
But yeah, it's really interesting too because I'm looking to next week, and race day now for 70.3 Coeur d'Alene next Sunday is going to be, they said, 81.
Hmm.
And so now I haven't been doing the heat acclimatization like we
Yeah,
talked
right,
about last
right,
week.
right,
I've
right.
been, hanging around here in the 60s and 50s, and then it's going to get hot for that one weekend.
I love it. I love it. So on this gravel race, do you know how
Yep.
many people are doing it?
I have no idea.
Okay. And is it up a path, a single track, or is it a road?
So it's it's actually a mix of gravel and path
Okay.
and some pavement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of like you're kind of on the pavement, off the
Hmm.
pavement, and there's some goes down to single track, some's double track.
Okay.
Um, I honestly have no idea what to
That's
expect.
awesome. I
It's
love
weird.
that. And here our club theme is fearless for this year.
Yeah.
And that's that is being fearless to be able to take on an event that you have no real idea about it and have not done that type of event before. And I think that's just going to be such a refreshing experience.
It's weird too because they say it's kind of like a time trial format. You start whenever you want.
Okay.
You have a start window between 8 a.m. and 9:30.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, if you want to if you don't want to get too cold waiting around and you're going to be faster, start near the end.
Mm-hmm.
You're not allowed to draft.
Okay.
They said you can draft if you're on a road and there's cars. You know what I
Okay.
mean? Like, and you can't safely pass. But other than that,
Yeah.
there's no drafting. They didn't give you they didn't give you any meters or anything. They just don't draft.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I really have no idea. Like I've only ever ridden on gravel a little bit.
Yeah. Right.
And so I was sourcing gravel tires, and I got my gravel tires set up
Yeah.
on my road bike.
Awesome.
And yeah, I don't know. I think it's gonna be fun, and like you said, it's fearless.
Yeah.
It's just like, you know, I've done lots of like climbs that are 5,000 feet in
Right.
elevation, but just never like this. And so it'll be fun. If I fall, I fall. And that's the only good thing about going uphill. When
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you fall, you're going slow.
So when you get to the top, are the post-race ceremonies at the
They're at
top,
the
or
top.
oh boy, so you got to have your warm stuff up top. So
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So that's the thing. Exactly. And then they're like, well, do you want to take a shuttle back or you want to ride your bike back? And I'm like, well, what do you think? They're like, oh, it's really fun to ride your bike back unless you've had too many beers at the top.
Oh, there you go.
I'm like, well, I don't drink, but
Yeah.
it sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, I
So,
love it.
and when I did that package pickup today, like, well, where are you from? I'm from Las Vegas. I'm like, no way, you came up here just for this. I'm like, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely, I did.
right, right, right. Well, it's going to be a beautiful course. I hope they have some good race photographers to get some
Me
good
too.
pictures as you head up. So that would be
Doing.
awesome.
We'll report back next week. And
Yeah.
it's so cool too. Like the old me would have never done this. Like
Mm-hmm.
if I was a week out from a 70.3,
Yeah.
I would, oh, what if I hurt
Right.
myself, or what if this,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm like in this post what if life right
Yeah.
now. Like
Right. Right.
just do
Yeah,
and
have fun, enjoy it, and
have
yeah,
fun. Yeah.
yeah.
So I'm looking forward to that. So John, the reason I wanted to talk about pace is I started to think about, well, how do I pace this?
Yeah.
Right?
Hmm.
How do I pace a race that I really am not don't really know what I'm doing?
Right.
And so I started thinking, well, how long is this going to be? I'm thinking maybe
Hmm.
2.5 hours. how do I pace 2.5 hours? Do I pace it like I'd pace the 70.3, which is going to be a 2.5 hour bike ride?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they're like, well, I don't know if I can, right? Well, and I don't have to, but I don't have to run afterwards,
Right.
right? And so I started thinking about pacing, and I started thinking about like, how many different paces do you have?
Mm-hmm.
Like swimming, biking, and running. And so I'm thinking in like swimming, I think I have 3 paces.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In biking, I think I have like 4.
Okay.
And running, I got like maybe 3.
Okay. So how would you describe your run paces, your three
Yeah.
running paces?
So run pace number 1 is just really easy.
Mm-hmm.
Run pace 2 is like my zone 2, just go out long. And then my next pace is racing.
I love it. Okay. So then on your bike pace, and you said you had four, how do you
Yeah.
describe those four? Just,
Yeah. So four is so kind of goes off of, I guess, like the heart rate zones, but like zone 1 would be like I call it a recovery ride,
mm-hmm.
where I'm just spinning. Like I'm trying to pedal the least amount possible.
Okay.
Then my next pace up would be my zone 2 pace,
Mm-hmm.
where I just kind of go for 3 or 4 hours. It's probably right now like 170 to 180 watts.
Okay.
Then zone 3 is, or so the next one up would be like 70.3 pace tempo.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one is like short racing.
Okay. All right. This is interesting. All right. Now I want to ask the last one. You're swimming. You said how
I
many
know.
paces on swimming? Three? How would you
I think
describe
I've
the
got
three?
3.
Okay.
So, and they're not very big. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's not big windows like there is in the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
So my slow pace is just comfortable, easy. I call it just comfortable, easy swimming. Um, the next one would be like race pace, like a 70.3 race pace. And then the next one would be, hey, if we're doing like in the pool and I'm doing like 50s,
Okay.
like, but the thing is, there's not much difference between them,
That's okay. That's okay.
right? Like
Yeah.
I don't have that many gears. And it's an interesting thing is I think when we start to think about like people that are really, really good at any of those sports,
Mm-hmm.
they have way more gears. They have
Right.
way more.
A range. Now, but here's what's interesting. And just listening to you describe this, we didn't talk about this beforehand. For your running paces, you described subjective perceived exertion.
Yep.
For your bike paces, you described a mixture of heart rate and
And
power.
power.
And for swimming, it's almost like you're describing more as actual velocity of swimming as opposed to, and maybe a little bit of perceived exertion there
Yeah.
as well. So it's
See, this is
interesting
why I
that
love
each
this.
sport, you've got a different perspective in terms of how to describe the different paces you use.
Yeah, and it's interesting in my coaching, I do some stuff is RPE,
Mm-hmm.
or to be more the subjective.
Yeah.
Sometimes I give power, sometimes I give heart rate.
Yeah.
And I think that like a good athlete should be able to know all of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like when you're out running, John, I'm going to assume you sometimes you keep track of heart rate and pace, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know within 10 beats a minute where your heart rate is, don't you?
I do, and it's pretty predictable based upon what pace I'm shooting for. So like if I'm running a 70.3, 130 beats per minute. If I'm
Yeah.
running an Ironman, it's 120, 124. If I'm doing a sprint race, it's over 140.
But
So
even if you were to go for a jog right now,
if I go for a jog right now, I would be in the easy range. So it would actually probably be between 100 and 120. It'd be
but
low.
you'd know, like I
Oh
bet
yeah,
you'd know,
yeah.
like you don't have to look at your watch and be
No,
like, oh, I'm
no.
120,
That's correct. Yeah,
right?
that's right.
And it's the same. Like if you knew your heart rate, you should pretty much know your pace.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is something I think really advanced athletes can do because
Mm-hmm.
they've been looking at their metrics for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's cool that we can actually do that, and you can learn a lot from that, right? So for example, if you're out running and you running at a pace, I don't know, let's say it's 9 minute mile, and for 9 minute mile you should be at 120,
Mm-hmm.
and you look down your watch and it's 140.
Mm-hmm.
What does that tell you?
Mm-hmm.
Like what would that tell you?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that can influence heart rate. And
Right.
we've talked about heart rate in the past as a good proxy for rate of oxygen consumption. In essence, that's why we measure heart rate, is to tell us how how our exercise is being done aerobically. And but the trick with understanding that relationship between heart rate and rate of oxygen consumption is it's not a one-for-one relationship. uh, that we need to know this equation. It's called the Fick equation. VO2, rate of oxygen consumption, is equal to heart rate times how much blood is pumped with each beat times how much oxygen is extracted from the blood. So you need to know those three things, and then you can predict VO2, or you can determine VO2. When we measure heart rate, we don't know stroke volume, nor do we know how much oxygen is being extracted from the blood for aerobic metabolism. And so when our heart rate doesn't perform as expected, that means stroke volume or how much oxygen is being extracted from the blood is changing. And that explains if we're maintaining that same VO2, that same intensity, a physiological intensity, and if heart rate's higher, that would likely mean that stroke volume is lower.
Right. And so what would cause that though for
Yeah,
you?
and so good question. So yeah, so what would cause stroke volume to change could be a number of different things. It could just be something hormonal. It could be the nervous system sort of ramping up if you're running and all of a sudden you get startled, something like that. Or it could be something more environmental in terms of temperature, blood being shunted away from the muscles and towards the surface or towards the skin to cool things down. And so and then obviously we have some, even how much blood volume we have and whether or not we've got enough blood volume there to that regulates stroke volume.
Yep. Okay. So other than environmental, so other than heat, what else can cause it?
Well,
You said
as I mentioned,
hormonal.
yeah, hormonal or psychological.
Yep.
It could be
The
something.
nervous system.
That's right. That's right. Maybe you're running and you're anxious about something and stressed about something. So that can influence heart rate.
Altitude,
Altitude, yeah, the amount of oxygen available, and hmm
oxygen pressure. So it's an interesting one when you talk about like heart rate and pacing. So I tend not to really use heart rate for pacing, especially on a bike if I have
hmm
power.
hmm
Um, and I've noticed that in a race in particular, if I get out of the swim, and my heart rate's usually quite elevated, especially when
right.
I run to my bike, right? And even if it takes me 2 or 3 minutes or 4 minutes in T1, I get on my bike and I look and I'm like, oh my gosh, like this power does not equal where this heart rate should be.
hmm
The heart rate's always higher,
Yeah.
right? And there's a lot of factors that go into it. So, like what you've done previously also matters.
Well, and you're right because there, if you're looking at swimming, you're in a horizontal position,
Yep.
and then you go to an upright position, you've got shifts in blood volume. But I want to, before we go down this path, I want to back up just a little bit because I really liked how you talked about pacing from a subjective
Yep.
and this idea that people should know different paces because I think you're spot on, and I think as we get better as athletes, we understand different paces because I've done a lot of work in the fatigue area and some work in pacing. And fatigue, we typically think of that as, something like a reduction of how much force a muscle can generate. And that's a classic definition of fatigue. But another way to look at fatigue is from a psychological perspective, in that it's a perception of how much more we can do.
Yep.
And so if we pick a slower running velocity, our perception of how much more we can do will be bigger. We can do more running and when we're running at a slower pace. But if we ramp up that velocity, then our perception of how much more we can do is going to start getting shorter. That distance is going to start getting shorter. And so when we're running a 5K, our perception of what we can do is based upon the speed we choose and knowing what speed you can tolerate to get to that finish line is part of what you're talking about. I mean, that's knowing that pace. And same thing, if you're trying to run a 70.3, a 13.1 mile run segment, you've got to pick a pace that you can perceive that you can get to the finish line.
Yep.
And knowing
And
that perception and that speed relationship is really important.
yeah. And, I gotta be honest with you, like coaching people on that is so hard,
Mm-hmm.
especially if, and figuring out like how many times they've raced
Yeah.
and what they've done that's been successful in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I have a really like, and this is for all the people that I coach that I know listen to this podcast, but it's a real challenge to get the run pace right in a long
Mm-hmm.
distance triathlon because there's so many other factors that go into it before you even get to the run.
Yeah.
So I can also tell you that for me personally, like I've done so many 70.3s that I don't even need my watch anymore.
Right.
Like I
Mm-hmm.
know the feeling,
That's
uh,
right.
what it's going to take to get me 13.1 miles,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know, based off of where my fitness is on that day. And we talked about this before St. George, but like one of my goals at St. George was to run as slow as possible, as long as possible,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Just because I knew where my fitness was. Now, coming into this race, my fitness is better, but the feeling is going to be very similar. Like I want to be kind of on the edge of not, not knowing for sure if I can finish because I
Right.
know I can,
Right.
right? Um, but then when I was super fit, I would have to dial myself back,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the first 2 miles. We've talked about that before as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is the only reason I wanted to know my pace was I wasn't running too fast in the beginning,
Yeah.
because I'd get so excited getting off the bike
Yeah. Yeah.
and there was that like, excitation. But I think that as I become more mature of an athlete, I've been able to control that more.
Mm-hmm.
So the advice I oftentimes give people is, in a 70.3 or an Ironman is run the first third easy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because we talked about this before as well, that during the last half or the last quarter of the race, the percentage of people that slow down is almost everyone,
Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm.
right? And we talked about this, both of us at St. George, how proud we were that we were able to run at the end
Yeah. Right.
and keep the pace going. Well, that's because we have experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to be that person that went too hard, set these unbelievable times for the first 5K, and then the last 5K is walking because
Yeah.
you end up
Falling
you,
apart.
you end up
Mm-hmm.
falling apart. So, but I think knowing your body and knowing those things is also really important. And then if we go back to learning what those paces feel like,
Mm-hmm.
and we've talked about this before as well, is let's say you want to run a 145
Right.
at 70.3. How often are you training around that?
Me?
No, but just people. No, but people in general, like around the goal pace.
Oh,
And
right, 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 right.
we get so caught up in this polarized model of
Mm-hmm.
long, slow, and then some
Yeah.
fast stuff. But I believe that we have to do some stuff that's pretty close to our race specific
Mm-hmm.
and not too far off of it on the bottom or the top. So if it's like
Mm-hmm.
this 80-20 model, and let's just give a number. Let's say I'm going to race at 9 minutes per mile.
Right.
I want to probably do some stuff above that,
Mm-hmm.
some stuff below that. For sure, but I do need to do some stuff right near it.
Right.
And I don't want to be too far below it, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to be too far above it as I'm kind of narrowing down. And the way I think about it,
Mm-hmm.
this is if I'm weeks away from a race,
Mm-hmm.
I can be further away from where I want to be.
I like that. Yeah.
As I get closer, I probably want the slower pace to get closer and the faster pace to get closer.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been reading a lot of stuff on like marathon running and marathon training because I'm thinking about doing a marathon. I know it's stupid, but I'm thinking about it. And another marathon. And a lot of this stuff is all this speed work
Yeah.
and so far away from what the goal pace is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think physiologically it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. I think I agree with you. And I think what's interesting and what you're talking about is you do need to train to recognize what pace you're running.
Yeah,
And that training is a perception, but as you even talked about already, that perception is going to change during the course of a race. It's going to change with environment. And so not only do you need to try to dial in that RPE, that rating of perceived exertion, that subjective feel of a pace, but you can also try to dial in some of the mechanics of a pace, running,
exactly.
stride frequency, or what your arms do, or how long your stride is. You can get a sense for those or pay attention to some of those things that might help people key in. And obviously, looking at a watch is one way, but I think you can run a pace. You should get to a point where you can run a pace and not have to look at your watch, because the watch is never exactly what you're running at that moment in time. It's a delayed, or it's an average. However your watch is set up, it's averaging data over whatever number of data points. It could be 3 seconds, could be 6 seconds, maybe longer, depending on the device you're using. So that when you look at your watch and it says this speed, that pace, that's not the pace that you're most likely running at that point.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like I think that a lot of people that I've talked to spend a lot of time at one pace.
Yeah, yeah.
Paces, right? So they got their zone 2 run, and
Mm-hmm.
they run that all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I've been trying to get people to do is even vary that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if their zone 2 pace is, I want to say, a 9-minute mile, it's like, let's spend some time at 8:30, 8:45. Let's spend some time at 9:15,
Mm-hmm.
9:30. And I want you to play with it,
Yeah.
and like do a kilometer or two at this pace, and then go a little bit faster,
Mm-hmm.
then, and vary it and get the feeling for what those paces are.
Mm-hmm.
And from a neurologic side, the ability to change those paces,
Mm-hmm.
I think, is really powerful.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
one of the classic run sessions is a fartlek session,
yeah,
and that's where you're constantly changing a pace for different distances. You're not even really doing a planned change in pace, but you're okay. Now I'm going to run fast to that tree. Okay, now I'm going to run super slow for the next mile or whatever it is. And so I think you're spot on. I think people need to explore what it's like to run and bike and swim a variety of paces. And the more that you can expand that range, the more options that you have.
I also find it interesting that, you know, in the popular media, this whole, once again, the 80-20 thing, it's like you're kind of set in that 80, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is the pace you should be going, like this heart rate. And really, I think it needs to be explained that that's a range,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's from, like, the middle of zone 1 to the top of zone 2. There's a lot of range in there,
Yeah.
and exploring that range,
Mm-hmm.
and being okay with it. Yeah, it's in swim, bike, and run. And I'm, once again, I think I told, like, we started out saying I don't have very many gears in swimming.
Mm-hmm.
But I do, right? Like, like I have the 3 gears, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to get into some different ones even.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I did a lake swim just yesterday, as I was thinking we were going to talk about this. And I did 4 500s,
Okay.
like prescribed was going to do, with like a minute-ish break between each
Mm-hmm.
one.
These are open water swims.
These are open water,
Okay.
and with the goal of having each one have a little bit different pace,
Okay.
and just learning for myself, because I don't spend a lot of time in the open water.
Mm-hmm.
I do, it's pretty rare for me to get like multiple swims in an open water in a wetsuit, especially. And it was interesting, like feeling the difference in the pace.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't much different. It was, when I went back and looked, it was maybe 4 or 5 seconds per 100 was
Yeah.
all that was different.
That's
But
big.
but the feeling was quite different, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I went from, like, I don't even know what I was at, like 150 to
Mm-hmm.
55, the perceived exertion was a lot greater than what the pace exertion,
Right. Right. Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then I started thinking, like, well, because when I went to the fastest possible pace, where I did 1 500 at like what I perceived to be my 70.3 race pace.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
started to get that feeling of, okay, this is what the race pace is. And then I look at the watch and I'm like, oh my gosh, was that worth it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Was the physiologic load of 5 seconds per 100 worth
Right.
the effort? And I didn't have good heart rate data, unfortunately. I wish
Mm-hmm.
I would have. But then I think about that, like, well, if I go to that one notch down,
Mm-hmm.
maybe the race takes me another minute and a half, but the energy I saved,
Yeah.
and not that, just that, like the psychologic energy of like being really uncomfortable for like a 35-minute swim versus a 38-minute swim.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That 3 minutes, I don't, maybe I make that up later in the race, and I don't know. And that's the fun part about triathlon, right? Is you don't know that answer.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. And it's not surprising that this relationship exists for perceived exertion and pace in swimming. And that's because the fluid you're moving through is dense.
Yep.
Water is 800 times more dense than air. And the main resistance force to allowing you to swim forward is a drag force. We know drag in cycling, well, drag in swimming is huge. And we also know it's the same equation, 1/2 rho CdAV squared. So the velocity of the fluid moving over you squared is going to ultimately be that drag force. And so that's why it's not surprising that a big jump in perception of pace may actually only lead to a little bit of change in actual velocity because it's an exponential drag force that you're experiencing. You try to go faster and you're hit with more resistance.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love the fact you bring that up because it's very similar in cycling when you start getting over 23, 24 miles an hour. To go 25, 26 is exponentially harder.
Yeah, right, right.
And same thing is like, is it worth the effort
Yeah.
to put out, 30 more watts to go another mile per hour? And it's the same in swimming. But once again, I think it's about feeling those paces.
Yeah.
And practicing. So we've talked about this on the podcast, but I've struggled with cramping in T1. So one of the reasons I wanted to swim more in the wetsuit in a lake and swim more at some race pace stuff is to kind of like tease that out. Right. And sure enough, yesterday when I did that 500, that was at race pace, my toe started to cramp, which I don't normally get a toe. And I'm like, okay, well, why?
Yeah.
Like, if I'm only going this much faster, like, why is my toe cramping? And what am I doing with my feet? Am I pressing extra hard to like try and reduce drag? But once again, I got to figure those things out in the open water because it never happens in a pool. So I think that's another little lesson as far as pacing is the difference of pacing in a pool versus pacing in open water.
Well, you reset at each turn, at each wall
Yep.
push off. And so open water swimming, you don't have that. So you're sustaining that posture throughout the entire swim if your 500 was in one direction. And what's also interesting though is swimming's a funny thing in that as you start to swim faster, sometimes it can feel a little bit easier at first because what happens is your mechanics get a little better and you have a little less drag force due to maybe your legs are not dragging as much, but now you're swimming faster and they're brought up. And
Yep.
now that's actually a reduction in CDA for swimming. And so you're actually gaining a benefit there. So sometimes I even tell people it's easier. Sometimes it's easier to swim faster. So it's
Yeah.
sort of a funny relationship. But then once you get to a certain pace, it's just it is that as we were talking about then it's much harder to go faster.
And I had I wasn't wearing foam goggles or anything. I had no metric until I got to the 500 and press pause.
Yeah.
Right. And like, oh, okay, and
Yeah.
so that's the other thing. And when we're talking about swimming, if you're not in a pool, even when you're in a pool, until you hit the wall or until you get you don't have feedback of pace.
Right. That's right.
Whereas like on your bike, most people have a bike computer that's telling them their power, their heart rate, their speed, their running, they can see just by tilting their watch. So I think it is a lot harder to develop these paces in the water. The classic swim coach, swim group pacing is probably really it's good, right? Like they're like, hey, do 10 100s on this pace. Everybody does it. And I also do 50s on this pace.
Right.
And I think there's something to be said for the pace work that the classic swimmers do, where they're trying to vary it. Now, whenever I swam in a group like that, I was such a poor swimmer, I had to bust my ass to go as fast as I could just to make the interval anyways.
Yeah.
But I think that there's something to be said for learning how to swim at different paces. And even for a triathlon like you and I do, we like to do sprint racing, we like to do long distance racing. I should have a different swim pace for my sprint race.
That's right.
That I do for my half Ironman. But right now I don't. I have my race.
And that is partly the way, and you've talked about this before, the way swim workouts are often designed is you say, let's do 10 100s on 2 minutes. So however fast you swim, the remainder is your rest until 2 minutes. And this is one way to do it. or let's do 10 100s on 145. The problem I see a lot of people making, or mistake I see a lot of people making, is they're swimming the same pace each time.
Yep.
And so you're not exploring that new ranges of pace. And so I think the way the swim workouts are should really touch on that based on what we're going on here is you've got to have some real range of speeds. Now, that being said, if I'm swimming a 130 per 100 versus a 125 per 100, that's a big difference. And so when you're talking about your speed range, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, that can actually be quite a bit of change in pace.
No, it's interesting you said that because with my coaching and when I put the swim workouts on Training Peaks, I never put on a certain time. I give you a pace and then I give you a rest.
Yeah, right.
And it's a timed rest. So if you swam it in 140, you still get 30 seconds. If you swam in 2 minutes, you still get 30 seconds rest. Because I think you're right. Like if you don't, then people just swim at the same pace because or swim fast. Like, oh, so I'm gonna swim fast so I get more rest. And then that's not the purpose, right? And it's interesting. As I started coaching some people that were actually classic swimmers, like they started looking at like, well, this doesn't make any sense to me. What's this on?
Yeah,
like, no, it's a different way to think about it, but it's in my mind, it's the triathlon way to swim rather than like the swimmer swim. And both can work if your coach is really dialed into you. Right? But yeah, that used to bother me when I had a classic swim coach be like, okay, like we're gonna do hundreds on 140. And I'm like, okay, I can touch at 137.
Yeah, right.
And the person beside me in the lane, they're touching at 110.
Yeah.
And we're going again.
That's right.
And they got 30 seconds break. I get 3 seconds.
That's right.
So what do I have to do?
Yeah.
I'm just swimming like I didn't even stop. I just turn at the wall and just go.
Yeah.
That's a completely different workout.
Totally.
And I'm not finding my range.
Yeah.
I'm just finding the survival.
That's right.
Survival range.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that triathletes do need to be careful about when they're swimming in a group that is doing that. And once again, I'm a big fan of triathletes swimming in masters groups and swimming in groups, but just be protective of that,
Yeah, and know what you're trying to develop, because doing what you said, where you're coming in on 3 seconds and then going, that can be a great workout for us, because you can check your pace, you can see where you're at and say, okay, that's okay, now I need to sustain that pace again. And I get another 3 seconds rest. Okay, check the pace and so forth. And so it is a way to dial in that pace. But you're right, that's a different workout in that instance versus the person who's getting 30 to 40 seconds rest. Totally different type of workout. Same set, different workout.
Same set, different workout. Exactly. So when we're talking about developing like different paces in swimming in particular, I think the advantage of doing it is, once again, for different distance of races, but for different race situations as well.
Yeah.
Right. So if I get if I'm swimming in a race, and we've talked about this before, if my theory on drafting is if I'm swimming side by side with somebody, we're side by side for 100 yards, and I keep looking and the person is there, I'm going in behind them. And when I do, I'm going to significantly have to change how I'm swimming.
Right.
I'm going to have to swim slower.
Or it's going to feel so much easier. Yeah.
But if I keep the same, I'm going to be on top of them.
Right.
So I have to actually have an easier pace. If I don't, there's an issue with that. Now the same is if I'm in a race and I look up to the right and I see somebody that they're like 30 or 40 yards and they're going about the same speed I am, I may have to go harder for 30 or 40 yards, which actually might take a minute or two to catch on to them. But then I need range to be able to actually race a triathlon. I think you actually have to have range. And then there's the other one where somebody comes by you and they're going by you just fast enough that if you get on them, then you can actually do your actual pace.
Yeah.
So
your perception of a pace, right.
Or they go a little faster than you can even hold on, but it might be worth it. Can I hold on for like 100?
Yeah, right.
Because then I've gotten up, those yards are done. And So I think that it's an interesting thing in swimming in particular to develop different paces.
Yeah, and that strategy of drafting off someone, that does introduce a whole nother layer of trying to sustain a pace over a distance. But you know, the other thing with challenging in triathlon is you go from pool swimming, where you're swimming in your swimsuit, and you go and put on a wetsuit, your stroke is going to change, your pace is going to change for whatever perception you have, and trying to dial in that pace while you're swimming with no feedback, no clock, no pace clock. Well, if you got the form goggles and you'll get heads up display of pace, well, then you get some feedback that way. But most of us don't have that, and not using for open water swimming. And so it's really, again, one of those things that trying to learn pacing based upon some of the mechanics of the stroke, what rate your arms are moving, how quickly you're breathing, things like that are really key to successful pacing in a triathlon.
Agree. Agree. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about pacing on the bike.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about in training to start out.
Yeah.
So what do you use to determine your pace when you're training?
I'm all about perception of effort. I am
Love
RPE all the way, and I really do zero in on the level of intensity I'm trying to get at, some from a subjective rating. But I do have a power meter, and I do look at my power, but it's more as a, oh, that's interesting type of observation. I'll be biking, and I'm at the intensity I feel I want to be at, and I look down and it says 150. Great. Okay, that's interesting. It says 180. Oh, great. I'm feeling pretty good. All right. So I use it more as a, I don't know, not a checks and balances, but more as sort of feedback in terms of how interpreting the intensity.
Okay, I love that. So now I know you don't do a lot of it, but if you're going to do some like higher intensity stuff,
hmm There's a couple of Strava segments I like to try to go after every now and
and
then.
is it still RPE or are you just like I'm going for it?
Well, the one segment that I really like to do a lot is it's just all out. I don't look, if I'm looking at anything, I'm looking at my speed,
Yeah, yeah,
because
because then you're like, okay, I might make it.
that's right, that's right. I'm trying to get, a certain time, and so I want to be above a certain velocity and so forth. So, but I do like to go back after I'm done with the ride and look at my power at that point.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, right? Like there's this there's debate on what we should be ultimately doing. And once again, I love to use RPE, I love to use power, and I love to use heart rate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's something special about each of them. And I think that the well-rounded athlete can use all of them
Yeah, that's right.
and the interplay between them.
Mm-hmm.
Because once again, if my RPE is 6 and I look at my power and on let's be whatever the scale is, like on 1 to 10, when the power is a 1, there's something going on here.
Yeah, right,
I'm
right.
and maybe I'm just too dang fatigued today.
Yep. Yeah.
And I look at things like, oh, my heart rate is not elevating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's central fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I need to do? I need to go home,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that there's something to be said for understanding those mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And then even playing around with like, with altitude. So, at Mount Charleston, for example, when I'm going, we're at 7,000, 8,000 feet for some of that ride. Well, of course your heart rate's going to be higher for less power,
Right.
right? And so understanding that interplay. When I go down to San Diego and I'm at sea level,
Mm-hmm.
the power is higher
Yeah.
for the heart rate.
Mm-hmm.
So what should I do? Should I go with the power or should I go with the heart rate? Well,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I better do? I better go with the heart rate, because if I go with power, by day 4 of being in San Diego, my legs will be done.
Yeah. Right.
And so I think that there's a lot of interplay that happens. Now, when I do specific structured training, like on an indoor trainer or like hill repeats or whatever, or I prescribe it, most of the time I prescribe power if
Mm-hmm.
if I have that available
Yeah.
to me. Mostly because heart rate doesn't change quick enough. If we're
Mm-hmm.
doing like, I don't know, 10 by a minute or
Mm-hmm.
even 8 by 3 minutes. By the time you actually get your heart rate to where you want it to be, it, you're almost near the end of your cycle of your interval. So I do play around with that. I think that using platforms like Zwift or something on the trainer is really teaches you so much about power and power's influence on heart rate, and especially if you use erg mode and you set yourself up. Let's say, okay, I'm going to do 150 watts for an hour, and just watch the heart rate.
Right.
Right, because the watts stay the same, and then you can really learn a lot.
Yep.
About that interplay.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I like I said, I prescribe a ton of stuff. Like, I sometimes I think the athletes I coach might get frustrated because, like, well, this week you did power, and then this week you did this, and then when you race, you tell me just worry about pace.
Yeah. Right.
That's all that matters, right? When it comes down to it, they never ever give away a trophy at the end for the most power.
That's right.
It's who got to the finish line first.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, in cycling, it comes down to pace.
Yeah.
Right. So okay, so that one's John, when you're out and you do RPE and you're peaking down at your power, would it ever be a red flag for you?
Oh yeah. Sometimes, especially in a race situation, I do use power as sort of a catch-all to avoid burning matches when I
Yeah.
shouldn't burn matches. And so I try to avoid getting to a point where it takes a lot of recovery from some bursts of effort. So I will be looking down and I'll say, okay, well, it's at this, if I'm doing a 70.3, if I jump up over 240 watts for sure, I'm like, hey, take it easy, back off, let's be patient for the day. Let's get back down to where I want to be. But, a little bit of, there's, course things that come up, little punchy hills you got to get up over. And I don't worry too much about those, but the sustained efforts of accidentally getting up into a range of intensity where my perception is not matching that, I try to gauge that. And that usually happens in the beginning of a bike. Get off the bike or get out of the swim, and I'm ready to go.
Well, especially when there's people around you too, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's
And
right.
you're racing to the front of this, like, the group,
Mm-hmm.
and that happens to me a lot. And I look down and I'm like, oh my gosh, like my first lap comes off at 10K.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh, I've done 250 watts. That's
Yeah.
too much.
Yeah.
But
Right.
I wasn't looking, and I was just into the race.
Yep. Yeah.
And it's a good pullback. Like, I always think in racing, the power number you're seeing oftentimes is to pull back rather than is to
Yeah.
go harder.
That's right. Right.
Where I think it's interesting, and as we transition to talking about running, I think running is the opposite. Like, oftentimes I look at my pace and I'm like, I get upset because I'm not going fast
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah. Right.
But I do think that once again, there's power knowing that and knowing your numbers really well, right? Like, if you know for sure that once you get over 240 for more than a minute or a minute or two, you know that the downstream effect is
That's
bad.
right. That's right.
Right?
If I get it, especially if I get up right now, my threshold is probably around 250. And so if I'm doing a 70.3, I'm pushing 260 watts or 270. I know I'm going to pay the price later. And so
Yep.
I try to really be careful that way. But yet I may be feeling great. Maybe, just feeling cool, just passing somebody or whatever it is. And so that's where I use power during a race, is really to, like you say, just to pull back a bit.
What I don't do, and I'll tell you this right now, in racing, is I don't ever use heart rate on a bike.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, it doesn't work. And it came to me this is several years ago now. On your bike computer, I don't know if it's on yours, because you don't use a Garmin anymore, do you? Use a Wahoo?
No, yeah.
Well, the Garmin will tell you, like, how you're doing today, basically.
Yeah.
I don't even know what it's called, but it was always coming out in a triathlon, and it'd say -6, -5. And I'd be like, well, that's not a really good thing, every time I was doing it. Well, what it was doing was looking at the first, I don't know, 10 minutes of my ride and seeing this elevated heart rate for the power I'm doing.
Yeah.
And normally when I go on a ride, it doesn't do that. But I'm coming out of a swim and a transition run.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I'm already elevated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, this is probably a really poor metric. Heart rate's a really poor metric in that context
Mm-hmm.
of a race. Then always, I mean, for me, I always take in more caffeine in a race than I
Mm-hmm.
do normally. I do have more anxiety.
Yeah.
Obviously, like once again, the first 10 miles of a 70.3, there's a lot going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's the bulk of the people you're going to be around in the race.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of stresses that
Yeah.
are going on. I can remember vividly one race looking down and being, oh my gosh, my heart rate's like 155 and my power is like this. And I'm like, that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
something is wrong here.
Yeah. Right.
And this was earlier on in my racing of the power meter. And I'm like, nothing was wrong. It's just
Mm-hmm.
I had an elevated heart rate because I'm racing.
Yeah.
And it had nothing to do, like, it didn't really even have to do with the oxygen delivery.
Mm-hmm.
I was probably delivering plenty of
No,
oxygen.
it's something with stroke volume or AVO2 difference. So what's
Exactly.
interesting is if we bring you into lab, and we've done this test, and you know this, and we bring anyone in the lab and put them on a bike, a stationary bike, and we measure VO2, we measure power, we measure heart rate, and we do an incremental test, and
Yeah.
you're always seated in the saddle. There is such a nice tight relationship between those three parameters. It is just beautiful to see. But as you talk about in real world, when you're out there biking, maybe you're using your upper body a little bit different. Maybe it's a course change that you got to do, or navigate something, or get like we've already mentioned, getting out of the swim and now you're upright. You're going from horizontal upright. You have a blood volume change. There's so much that happens dynamically that relationship between heart rate, VO2, and power can shift. And
Yeah.
so, like you're mentioning, I mean, it's just good to know these things and to know which metric to really look at.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's move to running
Mm-hmm.
and and running paces. And this is interesting because for running, pace has like been the classic thing that everybody's used forever.
Yeah.
Right? If you go back to like, the Roger Bannister days and
Mm-hmm.
the Prefontaine days, and this is it was all pace. Everything was pace. And so a lot of the literature is really good on running paces.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously, but 40 years ago, we started getting the first portable heart rate monitors,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we started to actually be able to look under the hood a little bit. But really, I mean, pace has been king for a long time
Mm-hmm.
in running. And as we started talking about that a lot of people kind of are stuck in a rut of
Mm-hmm.
pace,
Yep.
and every run is the same pace,
Yep. That's right.
and it's hard to break away from it
Mm-hmm.
because we get this kind of the central patterning of this is how we run.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're going for a run. The most efficient way we can run is like this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to develop different paces. So, John, what do you do in that world of running and pacing, and when you're training? Do you think about that, or?
Oh, totally. You know, nowadays is different than when I was younger. And when I was younger, all I had was my Timex watch that
Mhm.
had, at first it was only 8 laps that it would save. And then
Yeah,
then the watch came out and there was 20 laps that it would save. And it's like, oh my God. And you had to push the button every time you hit. It didn't have no GPS at all. You had to know where your mile was, and
get your mile markers on the highway, kind of.
yeah, something, if it's a course, I would drive it ahead of time and I'd know how it's laid out. If it's a race, then obviously you're relying on whatever markers they have on a race, and you'd have to hit your watch lap button and look at your pace and say, okay, that's what it is. So you would only get minimum feedback on a pace back in the day, and you'd only get a mile, at a time. And now you can, if you're doing 5K, you get 3 instances of what your pace is at that point. And so it was, that was on one hand unfortunate, but on the other hand fortunate, because it does force you to dial in that pace and that subjective feel of how fast you're actually running. And then you look at your pace and you say, okay, that was what, the pace I could sustain and so forth. Nowadays, I do look more at metrics if I'm interested in what I'm doing. Again, I'm perceived effort. I'm going out for a regular training run. I'm mostly just trying to keep things easy right now. But if I'm preparing for like a sprint race or an Olympic race or 70.3, then I do throw in some different bursts of different types of paces. And I try to get the brain to recognize what those different paces are. And they're not long bursts. I have probably a 3/10 of a mile section I like to run that I'll try a different pace for whatever event that I have coming up. Try to hit an 8-minute mile pace or maybe a sub 8-minute mile pace, something like that. But I'm only doing it for a very short period of time.
Yeah. I think that the neurologic side comes really quickly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You what I like to do with the couple weeks leading into a race is actually do some stuff like 1K at race pace times 3 or 4,
Mm-hmm.
with bigger breaks in
Yeah.
between, just to get used to that feeling of you can do it,
Mm-hmm.
and you can do it for 13 miles, but you don't need to.
Right. Right.
Right? Just get the turnover and get the feeling, and
Mm-hmm.
this is what the breathing is going to feel like. This is what this is
Yep.
going to feel like. And I do think that that's important. And you don't need to do a lot of it. Like you said,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't, like, that system actually doesn't take long to adapt.
No.
It's pretty robust.
And
You can, like you said, even like third of a mile.
yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the breathing rate because I think that is a big part of what maybe I tune into is my breathing pattern relative to my stride rate. And that changes based upon what pace I'm actually trying to sustain. And so I think, those are some cues to really zero in on how fast your feet are going, what your breathing rate is, where your arms are going, what your arm movement you're actually having. Those mechanical things can actually be really helpful.
It's interesting, this is a common thing that runners will tell you, oh, I can't run that slow because it's not comfortable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you haven't developed that pace,
Right. Mm-hmm.
right? It's the same as running fast. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you can learn how to run slower.
Mm-hmm.
And, many of the people that I've coached and people I've listened to, they've talked about, oh, this, once again, like trying to go easy and long, like this
Yeah.
long aerobic stuff. And they say, oh, my heart rate's too high.
Mm-hmm.
If I can't run slow enough. I'm like, you can.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy to change,
Right. Mm-hmm.
but you can. And it's a hard thing for people to recognize that you can actually run slower and you can develop a
Mm-hmm.
slower pace, a more medium pace.
Yeah.
But once again, when I've looked at people's files and they've come to me and I look at their files and I see a lot of stuff that everything's the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
Okay, you're happy at 9-minute miles. You're
Mm-hmm.
super happy there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, let's do some 10-minute miles. Well, I can't run that slow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's run some 8-minute miles. Well, that's my race pace. I don't want to,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't have there's not a lot of range. And it's something that I've been really working on with people is trying to develop a little bit more range.
I think that's brilliant. I think the more range that we can develop and the more confidence we have as a runner.
Yeah, agree. And then, running is an interesting thing too, because you have to factor in all like the hills,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Obviously in swimming, there's no hills.
Right.
In biking, there's hills, but we have gears.
Mm-hmm.
So really you could keep the same power
Right.
for the most part. But what do we do like when we do hills? And that's something that really also kind of messes with people if they're trying to really hit pacing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that, once again, you have to recognize when you're going up a hill, you probably, your pace is going to drop.
Mm-hmm.
You're going down a hill, your pace is probably going to speed up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're just just looking at your watch and you're oh, I got to hit these paces, I don't necessarily think that that's a good thing to do all the time. Now sometimes it is, right? Because now we're varying,
Mm-hmm.
understanding that hills do play a role in the pace. The other one we talked about last week is just heat,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
When it gets too dang hot, pace gets thrown out.
You gotta slow it down.
Let's slow it down.
Well, again, I mentioned this earlier, is that you start going up a hill and you look at your pace, that's not the pace that you're running at that moment in time. You've got to
Exactly.
understand how the watch works and that it is averaging over whatever time period the watch is set for. And all watches are a little bit different, but again, this is where I think I had an advantage running back in the 80s is I'd get 3 data points on a 5K.
Yeah. And then the other one is trail running. I'm a fan
Yeah,
of people
right.
who do trail running.
Mhm.
Well, you can never run on a trail as fast as you can run on the road.
That's right.
Even the flattest trail, if you get a little slip on every
Mm-hmm.
step, it's not going to be quite the
Mm-hmm.
same. And so oftentimes when I prescribe trail running, I'll just be like, hey, just run at an RPE.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And understand that, if it gets a little sketchy, especially in Las Vegas, we get some little sketchy,
Yep.
steep sections with some sharp rocks,
Mm-hmm.
walk.
Yep.
Like, I don't need you to hurt yourself on the
Mm-hmm.
downhill of the trail run,
Yep.
And it's so funny because when I do that, people have no problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But when I say, hey, let's go a little easier on this run on the road. Oh, I can't do that. But
Yeah,
on
yeah, yeah.
the trail, we can.
Well, it's interesting you brought up downhill running too, and your pace changes there. And we've talked about this before, and it's so important to learn how to run downhill. And in fact, when I do some pace work, the section of the run I do, it's actually just slightly downhill. Maybe not even 1% grade, but it's enough downhill that it allows me to sort of explore different ranges without working as hard, if you will. But you do need to figure out how to get that leg turnover for whatever downhill grade it is, and that's not an easy thing to do.
No, it's true. And I don't do enough downhill running myself just because I know the pain it causes
Mm-hmm.
and the how much it affects my bike riding the next day.
Yeah, yeah, right, right,
Oh, it's
right.
true.
Yeah.
Like if I and I used to there was I can't remember what race I was training for, but there was a good section of downhill on it. And I'm like, I don't run fast enough downhill. So I was really working it. And I'd notice every time the next day I'd get on the bike and my legs were just not
Yeah,
good.
yeah, right.
And so I was like, well, you know what? Maybe I need to be more careful with the amount of downhill running I'm doing.
Yeah,
And every time I tell myself this, okay, so this winter I want to do some downhill running,
yeah,
and I never do. It's kind of like, it's kind of like the classic triathlete. Oh, I'm going to add more weight training in this winter.
mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
well, maybe next winter.
yeah, I hear you. Ah,
No,
well,
John, I think that was good, and I think that gives people an idea of what we think about when we think
mm-hmm.
about how we pace things. But I wanted to just ask one last question about
Yep.
pacing, and because of the old school way you used to pace.
Mm-hmm.
So how is that translated into how you pace in a race now? And has it?
Well, Sand Hollow, I didn't look at my watch once on the run. I looked at my bike computer as I went along, and swimming, I had no idea. I think I did look at my time when I came out. I quickly looked, so I had no idea what my pace actually was during swimming. Biking, I was looking at my power and thinking about, my effort, and run was all on perception.
Yep. How about like a St. George, like your 70.3?
That was also very much on perception in that I was really trying to make sure that I was not going above a somewhat hard type of intensity for the vast majority of the race. I was really trying to be patient, and that's why I just kept telling myself, be patient, be patient. It's a long day. I wanted to make sure that I really was worried about the run, and I wanted to be able to at least have a successful run of the 13.1 versus a struggle or an implosion.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I'm very similar to you. I used to look at my watch a lot,
Hmm.
and it was funny because it would almost always make me upset,
Yeah, yeah, right.
like on the run.
Yeah.
So I'd look down and I'm like, I'm either going too fast, that would make me
Hmm.
upset,
Yeah.
or I was going too slow. And
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
how hard it is to run your exact pace you want to run.
Yeah, right.
Like in a triathlon, I think on a like a 10K,
Hmm.
or I think, or even like if you're a marathoner and you really train well, you can really hit paces.
Yeah.
But I think that once again, cumulative fatigue that goes into a triathlon,
Hmm.
uh, yeah, I can remember like actually being angry, like looking at
Hmm.
my watch
Yeah,
and like
yeah,
try and go faster,
yeah.
but my legs couldn't.
Right, right, right.
But I'm looking at my, I know I can go faster
Yeah,
than this. I've
yeah,
been faster than this.
yeah,
And my leg's like, no, dude, you can't,
yeah,
because those three climbs you did on the bike. Yeah,
yeah.
you're paying for it right now.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so then I went to the point where I literally, I wouldn't look at it.
Hmm.
You know, I wouldn't look at it. And I still like the laps go off and it beeps. And
Yeah,
if I happen to look at it, I look at it, but I don't let it dictate.
yeah, right.
Like for me now, it's more, once again, it's a feeling.
It's information that you're getting. That's about it. Yeah,
And at the end of the
yeah.
day, it's like, okay, I can maybe look back. I'm like, oh yeah, this section I was feeling good. So
Hmm.
what were things that led into that section? What was my
Hmm.
psychologic state like?
Yeah.
It's more like the post hoc
Yeah.
review
Right. Right.
is more important to me. But then if I was to race a half marathon open, I would be way more into the pace,
Yeah. 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 Right. Because you're
right?
starting off running and you
You're
don't
starting
have
off
all that
fresh.
swim and bike ahead of time. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's no other metric that goes into it. It's just like this is
Mm-hmm.
where you're at and you know your paces and you know where you should be. And I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a lot more you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, you're at hour one and you're almost done
Mm-hmm.
compared to in a half Ironman, you're at hour four.
Yeah.
And the
Right.
psychologic state is quite different.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can go deeper when you only got a half hour left or out of an hour and a half compared to a half hour left out of 4.5 or 5 hours. The psychologic state is, I think, quite different. And I think we need to think about that psychologic state when we really start to think about the pacing that we're
Mm-hmm.
going
Yeah.
and not not allowing it to make you upset.
Right. Right. No, totally. And any information you get back has to just be, oh, that's interesting.
Yep.
And then I think you're having a successful race. And I think the other part that I think we both emphasized here is in a triathlon is especially the longer the race, each segment you have to start off easier than you actually think you want to go at.
Yeah.
Swim, that first 200 yards, that should be so easy. Just ease into the swim. Bike, same thing. That's where I often make a mistake though, is that first 10 miles gets hard to hold back, but you got to hold back. And same thing on the run. Those first few miles of a 13.1, you gotta hold back.
And John, I think it's important we say this, and we're talking mostly about age groupers here, right?
Yeah, yeah,
We're not talking about the pros that just raced in San Francisco last
right,
weekend.
right.
They have got to go hard, hard, hard. There's no
Mm-hmm,
option.
mm-hmm,
We're talking to age groupers that are
mm-hmm.
not that are mere mortals,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that oftentimes, like once again, the popular media goes to what the pros are doing,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and we have to really think about this. Like
Yeah,
we're in our 40s, 50s, 60s. We need to be thinking like we're in our 40s, 50s, and 60s, and that this is
that's
not our
right.
job.
That's right.
And um, you know, we may be on the Formula One track,
Yeah,
but we're driving our minivans,
that's right. Yeah,
right?
I love it. Good stuff.
All right. Well, awesome. Hey, thanks for the talk, and look forward to hopefully another talk next week.
All right. Well, enjoy your cold gravel ride, and I am not feeling sorry for you one bit.
Oh, I don't want you to feel sorry for me. Even if I'm shivering at the top, but I know I will be. I'll be like, I'm not
I
in Las
love it.
Vegas.
Yeah. All right. Hey, have a great weekend.
Okay, thanks. You too.
All
Bye.
right. Talk soon.